New federal climate assessment for U.S. released. A new federal report finds that climate change is affecting the natural environment, agriculture, energy production and use, land and water resources, transportation, and human health and welfare across the U.S. and its territories. Volume 2 of the 4th National Climate Assessment (NCA4), released November 23, 2018 by the United States Global Change Research Program (USGCRP), http://www.globalchange.gov/about, focuses on climate change impacts, risks and adaptations occurring in the U.S. The report contains supporting evidence from 16 national-level topic chapters, e.g., water, oceans, energy, and human health, 10 regional chapters and 2 chapters that focus on societal responses to climate change. USGCRP also released the second State of the Carbon Cycle Report (SOCCR2), https://carbon2018.globalchange.gov/. NOAA is one of 13 federal agencies that contributed significantly to the 4th National Climate Assessment. Key findings of the NCA4, Volume 2. Communities. Human health and safety, our quality of life, and the rate of economic growth in communities across the U.S. are increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The cascading impacts of climate change threaten the natural, built and social systems we rely on, both within and beyond the nation's borders. Societal efforts to respond to climate change have expanded in the last 5 years, but not at the scale needed to avoid substantial damages to the economy, environment, and human health over the coming decades. Without substantial and sustained global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and regional initiatives to prepare for anticipated changes, climate change is expected to cause growing losses to American infrastructure and property and impede the rate of economic growth over this century. Agriculture and food production. Rising temperatures, extreme heat, drought, wildfire on rangelands and heavy downpours are expected to increasingly challenge the quality and quantity of U.S. crop yields, livestock health, price stability and rural livelihoods. Ecosystems. Continued changes to Earth's climate will cause major disruptions in some ecosystems. Some coral reef and sea ice ecosystems are already experiencing transformational changes, affecting communities and economies that rely upon them. Water and the coasts. Changes in the quality and quantity of fresh water available for people and the environment are increasing risks and costs to agriculture, energy production, industry and recreation. Climate change will transform coastal regions by the latter part of this century, with ripple effects on other regions and sectors. Many communities should expect higher costs and lower property values from sea level rise. Health. Climate change threatens the health and well-being of the American people by causing increasing extreme weather, changes to air quality, the spread of new diseases by insects and pests, and changes to the availability of food and water. Unintended consequences of dams and reservoirs. An international team of drought scientists show that while many dams and reservoirs are built, or expanded, to alleviate droughts and water shortages, they can paradoxically contribute to making them worse. The study is published in Nature Sustainability. Building dams and reservoirs is one of the most common approaches to cope with drought and water shortage. The aim is straightforward: reservoirs can store water during wet periods, and then release it during dry periods. As such, they can stabilize water availability, thereby satisfying water demand and alleviating water shortage. The research team behind the new study was led by Professor Giuliano Di Baldassari at Uppsala University. Their paper shows that increasing reservoir storage capacity can also lead to unintended effects in the long term and, paradoxically, worsen water shortage. The authors argue that there are two counterintuitive phenomena that should be considered when expanding or planning reservoirs: the supply-demand cycle and the reservoir effect. The supply-demand cycle describes cases where increasing water supply leads to higher water demand, which can quickly offset the initial benefits of reservoirs. These cycles can be seen as a rebound effect, also known in environmental economics as Jevons paradox. As more water is available, water consumption tends to increase. This can result in a vicious cycle. A new water shortage can be addressed by further expansion of reservoir storage to increase, again, water availability, which enables more water consumption, until the next shortage. As such, the supply-demand cycle can trigger an accelerating spiral towards unsustainable exploitation of water resources and environmental degradation. The reservoir effect describes cases where over-reliance on reservoirs increases the potential damage caused by drought and water shortage. The expansion of reservoirs often reduces incentives for preparedness and adaptive actions, thus increasing the negative impacts of water shortage. Moreover, extended periods of abundant water supply, supported by reservoirs, can generate higher dependence on water resources, which in turn increases social vulnerability and economic damage when water shortage eventually occurs. The new study also provides policy implications. The authors argue that attempts to increase water supply to cope with growing water demand, which is fueled by the increase in supply, is unsustainable. Hence, they suggest less reliance on large water infrastructure, such as dams and reservoirs, and more efforts in water conservation measures. In other words, coping with drought and water shortage by reducing water consumption, rather than fueling consumption by increasing water supply. While many water experts would agree with this general recommendation, numerous dams and reservoirs are still being built or proposed in many places around the world. Lastly, the authors posit that the notion that we must increase water availability to satisfy a growing water demand remains pervasive because there are major knowledge gaps in the study of the dynamics generated by the interplay of water, society and infrastructure. Thus, they propose an interdisciplinary research agenda to unravel the long-term effects, including the unintended consequences, of reservoirs, and other types of water infrastructure, on the spatiotemporal distribution of both water availability and demand. Millions in danger of food insecurity due to severe Caribbean droughts. Climate change is impacting the Caribbean, with millions facing increasing food insecurity and decreasing freshwater availability as droughts become more likely across the region, according to new Cornell University research in Geophysical Research Letters. Since 1950, the Caribbean region has seen a drying trend and scattered multi-year droughts. But the recent Pan-Caribbean drought in 2013-16 was unusually severe, placing 2 million people in danger of food insecurity. In Haiti, for example, over half of the crops were lost in 2015 due to drought, which pushed about 1 million people into food insecurity, while an additional 1 million people suffered food shortages throughout the region, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs. Examining climatological data from the 2013-16 Pan-Caribbean drought, anthropogenic warming accounted for a 15 to 17% boost of the drought's severity, said lead author Dimitris Herrera, postdoctoral associate in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Cornell. Beyond growing crops, the Caribbean also faces dwindling freshwater resources, due to saltwater intrusion from rising seas and pressure from agricultural and municipal sectors. This paper documents that human activity is already affecting the drought statistics of the region, said Toby Alt, assistant professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and a fellow at Cornell's Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. Hot temperatures in the future will probably continue to play an increasingly important role in exacerbating droughts. Although the Caribbean has recently been affected by catastrophic hurricanes, such as Maria and Irma, that caused significant and rapid damage, persistent droughts can slowly bring havoc to vulnerable Caribbean countries, said Herrera. This is especially true for the agriculture and tourism sectors of this region, which are the most important contributors to gross domestic product in most Caribbean nations. The research was supported by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the National Science Foundation and NASA. Wealthier people do less in the struggle against climate change. A collective risk dilemma experiment with members of the public in Barcelona has shown that people are more or less likely to contribute money to fighting climate change depending on how wealthy they are. And the results indicate that participants with fewer resources were prepared to contribute significantly more to the public good than wealthier people, sometimes up to twice as much. These are the principal findings of a study published in the journal PLOS One by researchers from the Universitat Rovira i Virgili, the University of Barcelona, the University of Zaragoza and the Carlos III University of Madrid, who measured how a group of individuals acted in the face of a common threat. To do so, they designed a lab in the field experiment involving more than 320 individuals divided into 54 groups of 6 people. The experiment was conducted as follows. A total of €240 was given to each group of individuals. Each member of the group was given a specific amount of money. In half of the groups, the €240 were divided evenly into €40 for each member. In the other half, the money was distributed unevenly in quantities from €20 to €60. Over the course of 10 rounds, each person then had to contribute to a common fund in order to reach a specific goal, namely €120 to be used in an activity against climate change, in this case planting trees in Calcerola. The participants were allowed to keep any money that was left over. At the start of the experiment, each participant knew how much money the other had, and at the end of each round they could see how much money each person had contributed. In this way, the researchers were able to test the economic effort that each individual was prepared to make for a common benefit, in this instance the fight against climate change. The results showed that, although all the groups achieved the collective goal of €120, the effort distribution was highly inequitable, explained Jordi Dutch, from the ALEFSIS Algorithms Embedded in Physical Systems research group at the Universitat Rovira I Virgili. Specifically, participants with fewer resources contributed significantly more to the public good than the richer, sometimes up to twice as much. The researchers concluded that the poorest participants congregated within the two generous clusters, whereas the richest were mostly classified into a greedy cluster. The results suggest that future policies could be improved if they reinforced climate justice actions in favor of the most vulnerable people and taught the importance of fairness rather than focusing on teaching people about generic or global climate consequences, as the latter have not been proven to lead to equitable contributions. In fact, the study demonstrates once again that cooperation is better than competition at achieving socially desirable outcomes, and that, in the case of climate change, cooperation is needed between all of the agents involved, said one of the other authors of the study, Anxo Sanchez, professor at the Department of Mathematics of the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, UC3M. Poorer and more vulnerable. The groups in which the initial capital was evenly distributed showed two different types of behavior, one where individuals contributed with quantities considered fair, approximately half of their initial capital, and another where people contributed with much more than was considered fair. In contrast, there were many differences in the groups in which the money was unevenly distributed from the start. Those with more money, €50 or €60, contributed less than was considered fair, in contrast to those who had less, €20 or €30, who proportionately contributed much more. These results show that, given the inequalities, the poorest groups are the most vulnerable and, therefore, are the ones who suffer most, explained Julian Vikens, currently a researcher for the Open Systems Research Group at the University of Barcelona. These data can be extrapolated and compared with the negotiations between rich and poor countries, where the most industrialized countries, which make the greatest contribution to global warming, have the most tools available to combat climate change, and the poorest countries are the most affected. These data can also be compared at local level, where people with fewer resources are the most affected by climate change and the most vulnerable. The experiment was conducted using a tablet to simulate strategic social interactions based on game theory and to present social dilemmas that generate tension between individual interest and the common good, and has involved classification mechanisms and machine learning to identify patterns of behavior.